The easiest person to ignore is often the one who needs kindness the most. A bitter winter wind swept across the stone walls of Greymore Fortress, carrying tiny flakes of snow through the narrow prison courtyard where silence had become as common as the iron bars themselves. Emily Carter pulled her worn gray cloak tighter around her shoulders as she crossed the uneven cobblestones with a small wooden basket balanced carefully in her hands. Every morning, she delivered bread and clean water to the guards stationed at the old fortress, a task no one else in her village wanted because the place was known for its cold stone corridors, stern soldiers, and forgotten prisoners. Emily never complained. She believed every place, no matter how dark, still deserved one person willing to bring a little warmth. As she reached the heavy iron gate, two guards exchanged amused smiles. "The rejected Omega is here again," one of them muttered quietly enough for everyone nearby to hear. The other laughed without looking at her. Perhaps she thinks kindness can unlock prison doors. Emily lowered her eyes but continued walking. She had heard words like those for years. Ever since she failed the traditional Omega ceremony, many people treated her as though she had little value. Yet she refused to let their opinions decide the kind of person she would become. Inside the fortress, the air smelled of cold stone and burning lantern oil. Rows of narrow cells stretched beneath high-arched ceilings where pale winter light slipped through tiny windows. Most prisoners remained hidden in silence, but one occupied the final cell at the end of the corridor. Unlike the others, he wore no chains. He simply sat upon a rough wooden bench with his hands folded calmly, his dark coat worn from travel and his silver-threaded collar stained with dust. His face showed exhaustion rather than fear, and although his hair had begun to gray around the temples, his posture still carried quiet dignity. Emily slowed her steps. The older guard noticed immediately. "Do not waste your sympathy on him," he said dismissively. "He refuses to answer questions. Probably another drifter pretending to be important." Emily looked toward the prisoner. He quietly lifted his eyes, meeting hers for only a brief moment before looking away again. There was no anger in his expression, only patience. Something about that calm unsettled her. She gently removed a small piece of fresh bread from her basket. "He has not eaten?" she asked softly. One guard shrugged. "He can eat when he decides to speak." Emily hesitated before kneeling beside the iron bars. She carefully placed the bread and a cup of clean water within the prisoner's reach. "You should eat while it is still warm," she said kindly. The guards immediately burst into laughter. "Do you think he is some honored guest?" one of them mocked. "He is only a prisoner." Emily slowly stood and faced them with quiet courage. "He is still a person." The laughter faded. Neither guard expected the shy Omega to answer them. For a long moment no one spoke. The prisoner finally reached for the bread, but paused before taking it. "Thank you," he said in a calm voice that carried surprising warmth despite the freezing corridor. It was the first time anyone inside the fortress had heard him speak since his arrival. Emily smiled gently. "You are welcome." She turned to leave, believing the moment had ended. But before she disappeared through the heavy wooden doorway, the prisoner watched her walk away with thoughtful silver eyes, as though memorizing the face of the only person who had looked beyond the prison bars. While somewhere far beyond the snow-covered mountains, the distant sound of royal horns began echoing across the winter sky. The distant echo of royal horns lingered across the frozen valley long after Emily Carter returned to the entrance hall of Greymore Fortress, but inside the old prison nothing seemed to change. Guards continued their routines with practiced indifference, while the narrow stone corridors remained wrapped in the same quiet loneliness that greeted every passing day. Emily finished distributing the remaining bread and water before preparing to leave, yet something urged her to glance once more toward the final cell at the end of the hallway. The older prisoner sat exactly where she had left him, holding the piece of bread carefully rather than hurriedly, as though even the smallest kindness deserved respect. She smiled faintly before turning away. "You really are foolish," one young guard called after her with an amused grin. "He will still be a prisoner tomorrow." Emily paused beside the heavy wooden door. "Perhaps," she answered gently, "but he does not have to feel forgotten today." Her quiet reply left the corridor strangely silent. Outside, fresh snow covered the fortress courtyard while a line of supply wagons slowly entered through the main gate. Emily helped unload sacks of flour and barrels of fresh water before beginning the long walk toward her small cottage beyond the village. Along the road, she passed neighbors preparing firewood for another cold night. A few greeted her kindly, but others whispered as she walked by. "She spends more time worrying about strangers than herself," one woman murmured. "That is why everyone calls her the rejected Omega," another replied with a shrug. Emily kept walking without slowing her pace. Their words still stung, but she had learned that bitterness only grew heavier when carried too long. The following morning, she returned to Greymore Fortress with another basket of fresh bread, warm vegetable broth, and a clean wool blanket folded neatly beneath the basket handle. The same guards recognized her immediately. "Back again," one laughed. "Your friend still refuses to tell us who he is." Emily looked toward the last cell. "Has he eaten?" The guard hesitated before answering. "More than yesterday." She nodded with quiet relief. As she approached the cell, the older prisoner slowly rose to his feet. Though his clothes remained worn from travel, he carried himself with calm dignity that seemed oddly out of place inside a prison. Emily carefully placed the steaming bowl of broth through the opening beneath the bars. "The nights have become colder," she said. "You should try to stay warm." She gently slid the folded blanket beside the bowl. Before the prisoner could respond, another guard stepped forward with an irritated expression. "Take that back," he ordered. "Prisoners do not receive blankets from visitors." Emily looked at him with calm determination. "It belongs to me." "Not anymore." The guard reached down and lifted the blanket. Without raising her voice, Emily stepped between him and the cell door. "Please." The single word carried no anger, only quiet conviction. He has done nothing to deserve freezing through the night. Several guards gathered nearby, watching with growing amusement. One shook his head. Listen to her defending someone she does not even know. Emily did not move. No one should be treated without compassion simply because they cannot defend themselves. The older prisoner remained silent behind the bars, observing every word with thoughtful silver eyes. Slowly, the guard looked from Emily to the blanket before letting out an impatient sigh. "Keep your blanket then," he muttered as he tossed it back toward her. Emily calmly picked it up and placed it inside the cell herself. "Thank you," the prisoner said quietly. This time his voice sounded steadier, almost familiar, though Emily could not explain why. As she prepared to leave, her eyes briefly caught the edge of a silver ring beneath the cuff of his sleeve, engraved with the shape of a wolf unlike any symbol she had ever seen. And before she could study it more closely, the distant sound of galloping horses thundered toward the fortress gates. The thunder of approaching horses rolled across the frozen courtyard until every guard inside Greymore Fortress instinctively turned toward the towering front gate. Emily Carter remained standing beside the final prison cell, watching as the older prisoner calmly lifted the warm bowl of broth she had brought him. He did not appear alarmed by the sudden commotion. If anything, he seemed quietly expectant. One of the younger guards hurried past the corridor entrance before stopping long enough to shout, "Royal Riders have reached the outer gate." The announcement immediately stirred the entire fortress. Soldiers straightened their uniforms, commanders barked brief instructions, and servants rushed to sweep snow from the entrance steps. Emily stepped away from the cell, not wishing to interfere with whatever important visitors had arrived. As she picked up her now empty basket, the older prisoner spoke once more. "Miss Carter." She paused, surprised that he knew her name. Turning back, she found him watching her with the same calm expression that never seemed to change. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Not for the bread." His eyes briefly settled upon the folded blanket resting inside the cell. "For reminding everyone that compassion does not ask permission before it appears." Emily felt a faint warmth spread across her face. "My parents always said kindness loses its meaning if we choose only those who deserve it." The older man smiled gently. "Wise people raised you." Before she could answer, the prison captain entered the corridor with hurried footsteps. "Everyone out," he ordered. "The royal guard is inspecting the fortress." The younger guards immediately moved toward the entrance while Emily quietly lifted her basket. As she walked away, she noticed the prisoner's sleeve shift slightly while he reached for the blanket. Beneath the fabric, the silver wolf ring became visible once again. This time the light from a nearby lantern reflected clearly across its polished surface, revealing a finely engraved crest surrounded by delicate oak leaves. Emily had never seen such craftsmanship before. She wondered whether it belonged to an old noble family, but the thought disappeared almost as quickly as it came. She reminded herself that appearances rarely explained a person's story. Outside, the fortress courtyard had transformed into a scene of organized urgency. Rows of guards lined both sides of the entrance, while stable hands hurried to receive the arriving horses. Emily stepped quietly toward the side gate, hoping to avoid delaying the inspection. Near the outer wall, she paused as two officers whispered to each other. "The Alpha King's royal guard has never visited Greymoor without warning," one murmured. The other frowned. Perhaps someone important escaped, or someone important was found. Emily lowered her eyes and continued walking, unaware that the conversation carried far greater meaning than she realized. High above the fortress, banners bearing the silver wolf crest fluttered proudly against the pale winter sky as a column of disciplined riders crossed the final stone bridge. Their polished armor gleamed beneath the afternoon sun, and every movement reflected years of perfect training. At their center rode a distinguished commander wearing a deep navy cloak trimmed with silver. He exchanged only a brief glance with the prison captain before dismounting. "Prepare the inner compound," he instructed calmly. "No one enters or leaves until His Majesty arrives." The words spread across the courtyard like a sudden winter wind. Every guard immediately stood straighter. Every conversation vanished. Emily looked back toward the old prison one last time before quietly leaving through the side gate, believing she had simply witnessed the arrival of an important inspection. Behind the stone walls, the older prisoner closed his eyes for a brief moment before slowly touching the silver wolf ring upon his hand, and a faint smile crossed his face as though he already knew the long-awaited reunion was only moments away. Greymoor Fortress awoke before sunrise beneath a sky the color of polished steel, and the entire stronghold moved with an urgency Emily Carter had never witnessed before. Fresh banners bearing the silver wolf crest were raised above the stone towers, while servants hurried across the courtyard carrying polished lanterns and ceremonial standards. Every guard wore freshly cleaned armor. Every corridor echoed with hurried footsteps, and every whispered conversation ended the same way. "His Majesty is coming." Emily carried her familiar basket toward the prison entrance as she had every morning, but the atmosphere felt entirely different. Two guards stood before the heavy iron gate, where only one usually waited. They exchanged uncertain glances when they saw her approaching. "The prison is closed during the royal inspection," one of them announced firmly. Emily looked down at the basket holding warm bread, fresh water, and another bowl of vegetable soup. "The prisoner has not eaten breakfast yet." The younger guard shifted awkwardly. "Orders are orders." Before Emily could answer, the older guard quietly sighed. "Let her through. She will only be a moment." The younger soldier reluctantly stepped aside. Emily thanked him with a gentle nod before entering the familiar stone corridor. Inside, the silence felt heavier than before. Even the torches seemed to burn more quietly, their golden lights stretching long shadows across the cold walls. She reached the final cell where the older prisoner already stood waiting beside the iron bars. He appeared calmer than ever, his weathered face carrying the quiet confidence of someone expecting an important guest rather than fearing an uncertain future. Emily carefully placed the soup and bread beside him. "Everyone seems nervous today," she observed softly. The prisoner smiled with quiet understanding. "Sometimes people become nervous when truth is about to arrive." Emily laughed gently. "That sounds like something my father would have said." The older man lowered his eyes for a brief moment. "Then your father must have been a very honorable man." Before Emily could respond, loud voices echoed from farther down the corridor. Three guards entered accompanied by the prison captain, whose expression revealed unusual tension. He stopped before the final cell and looked directly at Emily. "You should leave now," he instructed. "The royal inspection will begin any minute." Emily looked once toward the prisoner before quietly nodding. "Please finish the soup while it is still warm," she said kindly. As she turned to walk away, one impatient guard stepped forward and reached for the bowl. "There will be no meals until the inspection is complete." Emily instinctively moved between the guard and the cell. "Please do not take it away." The guard frowned. "Stand aside." Emily remained where she was. Her voice stayed calm, but her eyes held quiet determination. "He has done nothing this morning except wait." Another guard scoffed. You defend him as though he were someone important. Emily answered without hesitation. A person's worth should never depend on who is watching. The corridor fell silent. Even the older prisoner looked at her with visible admiration. The prison captain opened his mouth to speak, but before a single word could leave his lips, the deep sound of ceremonial horns echoed through the fortress. Every guard immediately straightened. Heavy footsteps approached from the outer hallway, accompanied by the unmistakable rhythm of armored boots striking stone. One by one the guards lowered their heads in perfect discipline. The prison captain whispered only 2 words, yet they carried enough weight to silence the entire fortress. The king. Emily slowly turned toward the entrance, completely unaware that within moments the quiet act of defending one forgotten prisoner was about to change her life forever. The heavy wooden doors at the end of the prison corridor slowly opened, and every sound inside Greymore Fortress disappeared beneath an overwhelming silence. Emily Carter instinctively stepped aside, while every guard lowered to one knee without hesitation. The prison captain bowed his head deeply, his confident voice suddenly replaced by quiet respect. A line of royal guards entered first, their polished silver armor reflecting the warm glow of the lanterns. They moved with perfect discipline, forming 2 silent rows along the stone walls before stopping together. Between them walked Alpha King Nathaniel Brooks. His dark royal cloak rested across broad shoulders, fastened by a silver wolf clasp that matched the banners flying above the fortress towers. The ancient battle crown caught the torchlight with every measured step, yet it was not the magnificent crown that drew Emily's attention. It was the calm expression in his silver eyes, the quiet authority that required no raised voice, and the strange feeling that he had already noticed everything waiting inside the corridor. Nathaniel acknowledged the kneeling guards with a slight nod, but did not pause to hear the prison captain's formal greeting. Instead, he continued walking directly toward the final prison cell. Confused whispers spread through the soldiers. The prison captain hurried after him. "Your Majesty, we have prepared a full inspection of the fortress records." Nathaniel answered without slowing his pace. Later, the single word carried enough quiet authority to end every further explanation. Emily watched in silent uncertainty as the Alpha King stopped only a few feet from the older prisoner. For several long moments, neither man spoke. Then, to the complete astonishment of everyone present, Nathaniel placed one hand over his heart before bowing his head respectfully toward the prisoner behind the iron bars. Every guard looked up in disbelief. The older prisoner smiled gently before inclining his head in return. "You arrived sooner than expected," he said calmly. Nathaniel answered with unmistakable relief. "I was informed only yesterday that my most trusted advisor had disappeared during his investigation." A stunned silence swept through the corridor. Emily slowly looked from the Alpha King to the older prisoner, struggling to understand what she had just heard. The prison captain's face lost all color. Nathaniel turned toward the gathered guards. "This man is Lord Benjamin Hawthorne, Royal High Counselor to the Crown." No one moved. No one seemed capable of speaking. Nathaniel continued calmly. He entered Greymore Fortress under a concealed identity to investigate reports concerning the treatment of prisoners and the conduct of those entrusted with their care. Lord Benjamin rested one hand upon the folded blanket Emily had given him. "I observed many things during my stay," he said quietly, "some worthy of honor." His thoughtful eyes settled upon Emily, others worthy of reflection. Nathaniel followed his gaze until he found the young Omega standing quietly beside the cell. "You are Emily Carter." She lowered her head respectfully. "Yes, Your Majesty." Nathaniel looked at the bowl of warm soup, the fresh bread, and the neatly folded blanket resting inside the cell. Then he looked back toward the guards who had laughed at her only moments before. "While others saw only a prisoner," he said, "she saw a human being." No accusation entered his voice, yet every word carried greater weight than anger ever could. The prison captain slowly lowered his eyes, unable to meet the king's gaze. Around him, every guard remembered the bread, the blanket, the mocking laughter, and the quiet Omega who had stood alone between kindness and indifference. Emily remained completely still, never expecting that the stranger she had defended with nothing more than simple compassion would prove to be the one man in the kingdom the Alpha King trusted above all others. And as the realization settled across the silent corridor, every heart present understood that the greatest judgment of the day had not come from a courtroom, but from a single act of mercy. No one inside Greymore Fortress dared to move after the Alpha King's words settled over the silent corridor. The crackling torches along the stone walls seemed louder than the breathing of the gathered guards, each of them standing frozen beneath the weight of what had just been revealed. Emily Carter remained beside the prison cell with her hands gently folded before her, still struggling to understand how the quiet stranger she had brought bread and blankets to each morning had become the Alpha King's most trusted advisor. Lord Benjamin Hawthorne stepped closer to the iron door as the prison captain hurried forward with trembling hands to unlock it. The heavy lock clicked open, and the iron gate slowly swung inward. Benjamin walked out with calm dignity, carrying the folded wool blanket Emily had given him as carefully as though it were a priceless treasure. Nathaniel Brooks greeted him with a warm smile rarely witnessed by anyone outside the royal court. "Welcome home, my friend," the Alpha King said quietly. Benjamin inclined his head. The kingdom remains fortunate to have a ruler who still values truth above appearances. Nathaniel nodded before turning toward the assembled guards. Lord Hawthorne entered this fortress willingly because reports had reached the crown describing unfair treatment, careless judgment, and forgotten compassion within places meant to uphold justice. He paused, allowing every soldier to absorb the meaning of his words. He was instructed to reveal his identity only if absolutely necessary. Benjamin looked toward Emily with gentle gratitude. "It became necessary only because one young woman reminded me that kindness still lives where authority had nearly forgotten it." The prison captain slowly lowered himself to one knee. "Your Majesty, I failed to recognize." Nathaniel gently raised one hand before the apology could continue. "This investigation was never designed to test whether you recognized an important title." His calm voice carried through every corner of the corridor. "It was designed to discover how you treated someone when you believed no title existed." The words struck far deeper than anger ever could. Several guards quietly lowered their heads, remembering the laughter, the careless remarks, and the blanket they had tried to take away. Emily looked from one face to another with quiet concern rather than satisfaction. She did not wish to see anyone humiliated. She only wished people would remember compassion more often. Nathaniel noticed the expression in her eyes and smiled faintly. "Miss Carter," he said softly, "you have remained silent while others judged you, and you have remained kind while others mocked you. Tell me honestly, why did you continue returning here each day?" Emily hesitated before answering. "Because loneliness becomes heavier when everyone walks away." Her simple reply filled the corridor with another long silence. Benjamin looked toward the Alpha King. "That answer is worth more than every report I have written." Nathaniel slowly stepped closer to Emily until only a few feet separated them. "You defended a helpless prisoner without knowing who he was." Emily quietly shook her head. "I defended a person." Nathaniel's silver eyes reflected unmistakable respect. "Exactly." He turned back toward the assembled guards. "Today, every soldier inside Greymore Fortress has witnessed the difference between obedience and honor. Obedience follows rules. Honor remembers humanity." No one argued. No one looked away. Even the youngest guards seemed to understand they had witnessed something far greater than a royal inspection. They had watched compassion become the highest measure of character. As winter sunlight streamed through the narrow prison windows, illuminating the old stone corridor with unexpected warmth, Nathaniel looked once more toward Emily before speaking the words that would quietly change the course of her life. "There is someone the royal court would be honored to welcome," he said, "if she is willing to accept an invitation." Every guard slowly lifted his eyes toward the quiet Omega, realizing that the rejected young woman they had overlooked only hours earlier now stood at the beginning of a future no one inside Greymore Fortress could have imagined. The invitation hung quietly in the air, and for several long moments Emily Carter could not find the words to answer. She looked from Alpha King Nathaniel Brooks to Lord Benjamin Hawthorne, then toward the familiar prison corridor where only hours earlier she had been mocked for offering bread to someone everyone else had ignored. Nothing around her had changed. The stone walls remained cold. The lanterns still flickered against the iron bars. Yet somehow the entire fortress felt different because the truth had finally been allowed to stand where assumptions had ruled. Emily lowered her eyes respectfully. "Your Majesty," she said softly, "I am honored by your kindness, but I do not believe I belong in the royal court." Nathaniel regarded her with quiet curiosity. "Why do you believe that?" Emily answered honestly, "Because there are many wiser people than I am." A gentle smile appeared on Lord Benjamin's face. "Wisdom is not measured by how much a person knows," he said. "Sometimes it is measured by how naturally they choose compassion." Nathaniel nodded in agreement. The kingdom already has many advisors who understand law, trade, and strategy. His silver eyes rested calmly upon Emily. Finding someone who reminds others to remain human is far more difficult. The guards listened in complete silence. Several exchanged uneasy glances as they remembered every careless word they had spoken to the quiet Omega over the past week. The prison captain slowly stepped forward before bowing his head toward Emily. "Miss Carter," he said with sincere regret, "I owe you an apology. I allowed routine to become more important than kindness. You deserved better from every person serving inside these walls." Emily looked genuinely surprised. She had never expected an apology. After a brief pause, she offered him a gentle smile. "Then let today become a better beginning for all of us." Her answer carried no bitterness, only quiet grace. Nathaniel noticed the expressions spreading across the faces of the assembled guards. The shame they carried was no longer born from fear of punishment, but from realizing how differently one young woman had responded to the same situation. "Lord Benjamin," the Alpha King said calmly, "what is your recommendation?" The royal advisor looked around the corridor one final time before answering. "Greymore Fortress does not require harsher discipline." He glanced toward Emily with warm admiration. "It requires a stronger example." Nathaniel slowly turned back toward the gathered soldiers. "Beginning today, every guard assigned to this fortress will receive the same instruction before assuming duty." He paused briefly. "Justice begins with dignity." No one questioned the order. Every guard bowed his head in complete agreement. Nathaniel then removed a finely crafted silver token bearing the royal wolf crest from inside his cloak and offered it to Emily with both hands. "This is not a title," he explained gently. "It is an open invitation. Whenever you choose to visit the royal court, these gates will always open for you." Emily carefully accepted the token, holding it as though it were something entrusted rather than awarded. "Thank you, Your Majesty," she whispered. "I will treasure the trust more than the silver." A warm expression crossed Nathaniel's face. "That answer tells me I placed it in the right hands." As the inspection finally came to an end, the heavy prison doors were opened to the bright winter afternoon, and sunlight poured across the old stone floor for the first time that day. Emily stepped outside carrying the same simple wooden basket she had brought every morning, yet it somehow felt lighter than before. Behind her, the guards quietly watched the rejected Omega walk through the courtyard with newfound respect, while above the fortress towers the silver wolf banners fluttered proudly against the clear sky, and far beyond the walls the news of what had happened inside Greymore Fortress had already begun its journey across the kingdom. The story that unfolded inside Greymore Fortress traveled across the northern kingdom with surprising speed, not because it celebrated a royal inspection, but because it told of a rejected Omega whose quiet compassion had accomplished what authority alone never could. Within days, merchants repeated the tale in busy marketplaces, travelers shared it around evening campfires, and village elders quietly reminded younger generations that true character was revealed when no one believed their actions would ever be remembered. Emily Carter returned to her familiar routine without expecting anything in return. Each morning she still carried her wooden basket filled with fresh bread, clean water, and simple meals for the people working inside the fortress. The silver wolf token rested safely inside a small cloth pouch beneath her cloak, rarely seen by anyone else. She had accepted it as a reminder rather than a reward. The guards greeted her differently now. Those who had once laughed at her quietly opened the gates with respectful smiles, and several even began offering warm meals to prisoners before Emily arrived each morning. The prison captain personally inspected every cell, making certain that each person received blankets during the freezing nights. Greymore Fortress slowly became a place where dignity was no longer considered a privilege but an expectation. One crisp winter afternoon, Lord Benjamin Hawthorne returned to the fortress accompanied by only a handful of royal escorts. Unlike his previous visit, he He wore the distinguished attire of the royal high counselor, his silver wolf ring visible upon his hand without disguise. Emily welcomed him with the same gentle smile she had offered the unknown prisoner weeks before. Benjamin looked around the prison corridor before quietly nodding with satisfaction. "Everything feels different," he observed. The prison captain answered honestly. "Not because we feared punishment, my lord." He glanced gratefully toward Emily. "Because someone reminded us what justice should feel like." Benjamin smiled warmly before turning toward Emily. "His Majesty hoped I would find exactly this." Emily looked around the peaceful corridor where prisoners and guards now exchanged respectful greetings instead of suspicious silence. "People changed because they wanted to," she said softly. Benjamin gently shook his head. "People changed because one person refused to let kindness disappear." Later that afternoon, the Alpha King himself arrived without ceremony, wearing a simple dark traveling cloak instead of formal royal robes. He walked beside Emily through the prison courtyard, where fresh snow sparkled beneath the pale winter sun. "Lord Benjamin tells me the fortress has become an example for other strongholds," Nathaniel said. Emily smiled modestly. Everyone worked together. Nathaniel looked toward the guards helping elderly visitors carry supplies across the icy stones. "Leadership often begins with a single example." He paused before continuing. "The Royal Council has approved a new standard for every prison in the kingdom. Every officer assigned to oversee prisoners will first receive instruction that justice without compassion is incomplete." Emily stopped walking for a moment, genuinely surprised. "That is a great responsibility." Nathaniel looked toward the snow-covered mountains beyond the fortress walls. "It is also a necessary one." He then turned back toward her with quiet sincerity. "Your actions changed more than one prison." Emily lowered her eyes, humbled by the thought. "I only chose what my parents taught me." Nathaniel smiled warmly. "Then their kindness now protects people they will never meet." As the afternoon sunlight bathed Greymore Fortress in a soft golden glow, villagers gathered outside the gates watched the Alpha King and the quiet Omega walking side by side through the courtyard, not as ruler and subject separated by status, but as two people united by the shared belief that compassion remained the strongest foundation upon which any kingdom could stand. And throughout the Northern Kingdom, that belief continued spreading farther than anyone could have imagined. Several months later, the first days of spring brought fresh life to the valleys surrounding Greymore Fortress, replacing snow-covered fields with green hills, blooming wildflowers, and clear streams that reflected the morning sun. Travelers who passed through the region often paused outside the fortress gates, surprised to find a place once known for cold silence now filled with quiet respect and steady kindness. Prisoners received warm meals, clean blankets, and fair treatment without exception. Guards greeted visitors with patience instead of suspicion, and every new recruit learned the same lesson before receiving the fortress keys. Justice protected order, but compassion protected dignity. Emily Carter continued living exactly as she always had. She still carried her simple wooden basket every morning, still smiled at strangers before they smiled at her, and still believed that every person deserved to be seen before being judged. The silver wolf token remained safely beneath her gray cloak, never displayed to impress anyone. To Emily, it represented responsibility rather than recognition. One peaceful afternoon, a familiar group of riders approached the fortress, though this time there were no ceremonial banners, no formal announcement, and no rows of waiting soldiers. Alpha King Nathaniel Brooks arrived with only Lord Benjamin Hawthorne and a small royal escort, choosing simplicity over ceremony. As soon as Emily noticed them entering the courtyard, she greeted them with the same warm kindness she had offered the unknown prisoner on the very first day they met. Nathaniel smiled as he accepted a cup of fresh water from her hands. "You welcome a king exactly as you welcomed a stranger," he observed. Emily laughed softly. "Everyone becomes thirsty after a long journey." Lord Benjamin exchanged an approving glance with the Alpha King before looking around the peaceful courtyard. "Nothing about her has changed," he said quietly. Nathaniel nodded. "That is why the kingdom continues changing." Together, they walked through the fortress while guards respectfully opened doors and prisoners peacefully thanked those delivering their meals. There was no fear in the air, only quiet order built upon mutual respect. Nathaniel stopped beneath the old stone archway overlooking the valley and turned toward Emily. Do you remember the first piece of bread you offered inside these walls? Emily smiled as the memory returned. I remember hoping it would still be warm. Nathaniel looked across the fortress where countless small acts of kindness had become ordinary. One piece of bread became a lesson for an entire kingdom. Emily gently shook her head. People changed because they chose to. Nathaniel answered with calm certainty. Someone first showed them they could. As the afternoon sunlight spread across the courtyard, children from the nearby village arrived carrying baskets of flowers to decorate the fortress entrance for the annual spring celebration. They greeted Emily with cheerful smiles, no longer calling her the rejected Omega, but thanking her for the kindness she showed everyone. The guards who had once laughed now happily helped the children arrange colorful blossoms beneath the silver wolf banners. Nathaniel watched the simple scene with quiet satisfaction before turning to Lord Benjamin. A kingdom is never remembered only for the strength of its walls. Benjamin completed the thought with a gentle smile. It is remembered for the strength of its heart. Emily looked around the courtyard where compassion had quietly become part of everyday life. Realizing she had never changed the world through power, wealth, or recognition. She had simply refused to stop treating people with dignity when no one else believed it mattered. As warm spring winds carried laughter across the fortress and sunlight illuminated the ancient stone walls, the story of the rejected Omega continued traveling far beyond the kingdom's borders, reminding everyone who heard it that the greatest leaders do not always wear crowns, and the greatest victories often begin with one ordinary person choosing kindness when no one else is willing to stand beside them.